the session today is on difficult conversations, which is something I think that lots of us think about, struggle with, have had in the past, and I thought it would be useful just to do the session today kind of focused on difficult conversations because I have many conversations about them. I know many of you online know me already. There are some new faces, so I will give a little bit of an introduction to who I am because it will inform the way that this session is going to run. So I'm Claire, and I have had what is now kindly called a squiggly career, which means that I wear many hats. And the two main hats that I wear at the moment are business developer is one of the hats. So I do a lot of business development consultancy and training. And the other hat that I wear often is my coaching hat. So I have been an executive coach now for over 10 years. I'm senior practitioner with the EMCC and I team coach as well. And the reason why that is relevant is because a lot of what I do comes back to coaching. And for me, coaching is, we could go down a rabbit hole of what is coaching, but for me, the reason why coaching is so powerful and the reason why so many people are now coaches or use coaches is because it is all about self-awareness. And I think this topic in particular is one where what is a difficult conversation for me might not be what a difficult conversation is for Millie and for others on the call. So it's very personal, and that's the approach that I will take for the hour today. So we will kind of go through two things. So the idea is for the first kind of half of this session, we're going to explore what difficult conversations are. So what might they be for you in particular? What might they be for others? And are they difficult for you or are they difficult for the other person or maybe both of you? So we're going to kind of unpick a little bit what we mean by difficult conversations. And then in the second half, we'll try and do a little bit of a so what. And okay, great, whatever emerges as difficult for me has emerged, and therefore, how can I deal with that? How can I lean into them? How can I have these difficult conversations that I have to have? Because at the end of the day, that's life. So that's the plan. Hopefully, that's what everyone was expecting and what everyone signed up for. This will be interactive. I know that not everyone has got their cameras on. So when we get to discussions, we'll see how we go. We might try and just do a discussion in a bigger group. I know that at lunchtime, some people might be eating or kind of listening, but doing something else. So we'll see how we go in terms of breakouts and what emerges in the room. So that's the plan. Before I start talking, what would be really helpful is if you could just pop in the chat who you are, where you're joining from, and just kind of, what it was about the difficult conversations headline that kind of piqued your interest and made you show up today. Just kind of, chat away in the background, and I'll pick that up in a second. And whilst you're doing that, some of you, I appreciate that some people signed up quite late, so you might not have had an email from me, but some of you will have had an email from me earlier on this morning, thanking you for signing up, giving you the link, but also inviting you to think about a difficult conversation that you might have had recently. Maybe it wasn't recently, but it's really sort of hung around and stuck with you. Or maybe you've signed up today because you've got a difficult conversation coming up and you wanted to get some tips and tricks to try and lean into and face that conversation. And what I'd love is, and with today, share what you feel comfortable sharing, share as much as you feel is helpful. If you don't want to share, that's fine. We'll see kind of what emerges in the room. But if anyone would like to share, for them, what scenario, what difficult conversation have they kind of got in mind that perhaps is something that we can explore and pick up. What I'm going to do when we get to part two is I'm going to invite you to think about that example. So even if you don't want to share it, and you won't have to share it in part two, bring one to mind because we'll use that as a sort of an example as we go through. So does anyone want to jump in and share either a difficult conversation that they've had or maybe one that they've got coming up?
Claire, I'm happy to start if you want, because my conversations is quite easy for people to relate to it. So I'm an events manager, and my difficult conversations are usually when something has been booked and agreed and planned between me and the venue, and then the client turns up, and usually they're senior partners or senior associates from law firms, and they turn up to the venue, and that thing is not quite right. Or I had an event recently where they hadn't told me that scaffolding was going up around the building, and it was creating a big impact of noise into the meeting room space. So it's difficult for me because the venue's not told me what's happening. Then I've got the client who's grumpy. They're in front of their clients, so they don't want to be grumpy, and so it all just blows up, and it's quite embarrassing. And I'm trying to calm everything down, whilst also being in the dark because I didn't know it was going to happen.
Okay, perfect. There's a lot there that will emerge as we go through. So I won't pull any more out. Does anyone else want to share an example? It could be a specific, or it could be like Millie, just kind of generally these tend to be the types of difficult conversations that I have.
I think for me, it's the ones that you don't expect to be difficult, and you go in thinking that it's going to be a good conversation, positive conversation. Then it doesn't tend to be that way, and it's that trying to think on your feet and how to get that situation back to that positive meeting that you're trying to have.
Okay. Interestingly, I'm taking notes to kind of prompt me and remind me as we go along. And Millie, I kind of jotted down things not as expected. And then Francesca, yours is kind of expected again. It's this kind of surprise, isn't it? Let me throw in some examples. And as I said, hold on to an example because I'm going to invite you to explore and think about it a little bit in part two. But let me share with you some thoughts that I had as I was putting these slides together around kind of difficult conversations. And I've got some examples on there, and you might identify one of those circles with the thing that came up. So, Millie, perhaps a kind of a, there's an element there, isn't there, giving someone bad advice that, turning up, not realizing that the scaffolding was there, and oh, now I'm going to have to break the news, or conflict, disagreement. Again, this idea that things aren't quite aligned. Francesca, same with you. Actually, I was expecting this to go really well, and all of a sudden there's some conflict here that I wasn't expecting. So these were just things that came to mind. I put talking about pay. For me, I was thinking about, what would I put in the bracket of difficult conversations for me? And I actually find talking about money really difficult. And there's probably lots of reasons behind that. The way I was brought up, I don't know, it's probably I could probably go to therapy and unpick it. But both in terms of when I was sensible and had a day job, and talking about salary negotiations, I found those always very tricky. Now that I'm external and having to talk to clients about money, I find it incredibly challenging and difficult and uncomfortable. So that's why that one's up there. But you can probably recognize all of these some way, shape, or form. And the thing that I really want you to take from this slide, and I'm going to kind of meander through some slides and then we'll have a bit of a discussion, is when we think about difficult conversations and what that means for us, are they difficult because they are difficult for us? Are they difficult because they're difficult for the other person? So I'll give an example. So I was kind of bashing some thoughts around with my husband, and I sort of said to him, well, what's a difficult conversation for you? And he said, well, a difficult conversation would be where I've got to let someone go, or so that would be the bracket. And actually there it's probably more difficult for them than it is for him when you think about the dynamics. Are they difficult for both of us? So questions that I want you to start to think about. And again, if you've got a particular example in mind, who are they difficult for? Because that will help inform when we go forward how we can deal with those. And once I kind of had fleshed out these thoughts around why are they difficult, I had to think about kind of how you might bracket these up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to share this, and then I'm going to share a model, and then we'll kind of go into a discussion. And I think we'll keep the discussion as kind of whoever wants to speak can speak, and whoever doesn't want to speak can stay and just observe and listen. Um, But these four things came to mind. And again, you might identify some of these within that conversation that you've got as your example that we're working through. So the first thing that I came up with was identity. And I think that I did a session a little while ago on feedback and feedback triggers and what makes feedback difficult. And there's a lot of overlap because for some people, your difficult conversation might be feedback, either receiving or giving it. And sometimes we get feedback that hits at who we are as a person. And when we have conversations that really kind of drive towards who we are, they can be ones that kind of fall into that difficult bracket. So they threaten who we believe we are, or maybe they make us look bad or look like a fake. I'm going to keep using Millie as an example because I know her and B, she's given the example. But again, the elements of that perhaps in your situation where your identity is wrapped up in how you deliver in doing a good job, and things that kind of throw off course don't just throw off the event for you, they actually throw up who you are and how you show up as a professional. So really interesting. A lot of what I do, and I've kind of read some of the comments, is client listening, and sometimes these client feedback interviews that we have, when we have to feed them back to lawyers or accountants or whichever professionals that we're doing the listening for, can challenge that identity. I'm a good lawyer, I'm a good accountant, and all of a sudden I've got this information that sort of sits uneasily alongside it. I think that without exception, and I'd be interested to hear if anyone disagrees, without exception, there is a level of emotion involved in these difficult conversations. And again, Millie, using your example, whether that's frustration or disappointment or worry, there is always, I think, an element of emotion that sits alongside these difficult conversations. I think often, and again, I was kind of looking at what united some of the examples that I shared. Power dynamics, I think, are often at play. So again, we'll use Millie's example. There are dynamics between you and your client. There are dynamics between the client and their client. There are dynamics between you and the venue. I mean, all sorts of kind of power dynamics going on and in the background that make for a difficult conversation. And uncertainty, and for anyone who knows me, I don't over prepare these things because I do like to see what emerges. So it's not planned and it's not rigged. So it's interesting that both of the examples where I jotted down expected, unexpected, I think it's this uncertainty actually that often is at play when we talk about difficult conversations. So I'm going to share a model with you, and then I'll sort of pause and we can have a bit of a discussion. Some of you who have been on sessions with me before might have seen this model, or if there are coaches online, you might have seen this model before. And it's a model that comes up in lots of different guises and ways. And actually, again, looking through and thinking about difficult conversations and the coaching conversations I have about difficult conversations, this model came to mind. So I'm going to share it because actually I think it's quite useful when we think about those difficult conversations that we can prepare for, or perhaps in the moment understanding the difficult conversations that we're in. So this model, which has got an acronym, which is helpful because it does help to remember it. If you remember the acronym, you can at the very least Google the acronym to remember what the elements of it are. Was devised by someone called David Rock, for those who are interested and want to go down a rabbit hole of finding out more. And it pops up in lots of different ways. So it's described in different ways. In some situations, it's described as a model for psychological safety. In others, it's described as a model for motivation, lots of different things. But at its heart, it is about behavior. It's about our interactions with others. And it is a really good way of understanding the drivers that we have and the way that we can feel threatened or empowered as individuals. And it goes back to, are these difficult conversations difficult for us, or are they difficult for the other person? Because it could be that we are feeling threatened. It could well be that the other person is feeling threatened. And again, Millie, your example is perfect in that regard, because there's both elements there, isn't there? You're feeling threatened because actually this is your relationship and what you do. But actually your client is also feeling threatened because their clients have showed up and that relationship potentially has got an element of threat there. So the model defines these 5 domains. I like to think of them as drivers. I think David Rock described them as domains, so we'll stick with that. And they are things that we as humans look for, strive for, are important to us. And you can read them there, but status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And all of a sudden, we can see some of those things that I identified in some of the earlier slides coming through. So this element of uncertainty, certainty, it's something that actually we look for. So where there is the element of the unexpected, that can leave us feeling threatened and throw us off course. Status, again, interesting. I mentioned there about the kind of the different dynamics, the power dynamics that can threaten our status. And it can also threaten who we think we are, because our status, depending on how we tie our identity into our status, that can also leave us shifting and throwing us off course. So I'll leave this model up and I'll share the slides afterwards. So feel free to take notes if that's how you process and think. I do, but if you likewise, if you just want to sit back and listen, I'll share the slides with you. But I started to think about some of the ways that some of these things might, how they might show up in difficult conversations. And I'll kind of give a couple of examples, but maybe again we can kind of just, I think I can see most people have got their cameras off, so we'll just leave it as kind of a smaller chat amongst those who are comfortable chatting. And if anyone wants to jump in, feel free. If you feel comfortable just jumping into the chat but not having a camera on, do what works for you. But again, we'll use Millie's example, if I can. I know, Millie, I'll buy her a drink later. In fact, I owe you a drink. It's been ages. We do need to have a drink at some point soon. So I'll use Millie's example. We can start to think how some of them, some of these elements of this model might be at play with the example that Millie gave us. So status. So it's about, the dynamics, how important we are in relation to others. And one of the ways it might show up in a difficult situation is someone might feel humiliated. And, that's quite a powerful statement, isn't it? But again, you can see with Millie's example that there's possibly an element of that there, that, Millie's promised an event that's going to work, that don't worry, I'm on it. And there's an element of, how was it that I didn't know that the scaffolding was there, or whatever it might be. So there is a degree of that within that example. We strive for certainty, for predictability, and really interesting that both of the examples that we had that element of, oh gosh, how's this going to go? What's going to happen now? I don't know. Autonomy, we like to be able to feel like we're in control. And, again, Millie's example, really good example that, we plan, we make sure we know things are going to happen in the way that we expect them to. And all of a sudden something throws in the mix that throws us out of control. So that leaves us feeling threatened. Relatedness, do I feel safe here? It's, kind of a fundamental question. Do I feel connected? Where tempers start to flare, we start to feel like, oh, maybe this isn't a safe position for me to be in between all of these different dynamics going on around us. And fairness, again, something that we can strive for. And where I've used this model before, and I'll share it because I'm sharing this model, where we lead teams, it is helpful to know this model. And what tends to happen is that we tend to, as individuals, some of these might be more important to us than others. And actually having an understanding of what is, for me, the most important of these is a helpful piece of self-awareness to have. But also starting to understand how do my team react can be really helpful, because you can start to see, well, actually, I can see that Anna really needs certainty. So I need to make sure that when I'm doing things, I'm building that in. Or I can see that Millie really needs autonomy, so I really need to watch out when I'm micromanaging. So this model is really useful in a number of different ways. And I always start with some self-disclosure because I always overshare. But for me, I think of all of these, relatedness is the one that really, well, in fact, two, relatedness and fairness for me are really strong drivers. So if I see something to be unfair or perceive something to be unfair, that really throws me off. And I have a really high need to be liked, to connect with people. So those two for me are really big drivers. And again, if I think about the difficult conversations for me, they tend to fall into those two brackets. It's that, well, maybe that person doesn't like me, kind of narrative that ends up going on in my head. So I'm going to pause there before I kind of tie all up the kind of first half around why they're difficult. But we've got some time to explore. So whether it is, that's interesting, that was my example, and now I can sort of see how it fits in, whether it's a question, whether it's an observation about looking at this, I can see the autonomy. Whatever you feel you want to share, let's share it and we'll sort of generate a bit of a conversation. Who wants to be brave and go first? It's a really broad invitation. So if you're sitting there thinking, what on earth did you expect me to say? It's really an invitation, either to, again, share an example and we can kind of unpick it, or maybe some looking at this thinking, oh, that's interesting. I've never really thought about it. Or, yeah, seeing that I can see I'm really, for me, this is the one that is my button.
I don't mind giving an example, Claire, which is something that those of you who are working in teams might find. So this is not related at all to client listening or anything that we do, but when I worked in house in teams, I was managing somebody that was quite tricky. And it was somebody who their sort of behavior and the things that they were doing it was quite low level in terms of being 5 minutes late every day, and just nothing major, or just being slightly out of how I would expect them to be behaving or performing or whatever. And it was that kind of, I just hated having those conversations with him. I don't like conflict and confrontation anyway. And I felt, well, felt a bit daft saying, well, so it's fine, you're 5 minutes late every day, but 5 minutes late every day adds up to a lot when everybody else is there early or on time or whatever. And it's about, I know it's about respecting the rest of the team, but that was something that I always found really, yeah, difficult to navigate.
So looking at this model, thinking about those conversations that you found difficult, maybe you avoided the conversations, which is again, and again, it's interesting, isn't it? Conflict is another I always find interesting. But looking at these domains, which of these do you think might have come into play? Might have been thrown off kilter by the conversation?
I think a bit of autonomy in terms of that person was could be quite, what's the word? Eruptive, if that was a word. That you think, oh God, they're gonna blow up, and that sort of thing, I think was at play. But then, yeah, the other thing that I think that I felt that why it needs to be addressed is around the fairness point to the rest of the team. So there's quite a lot that was sort of going on there. So yeah, and I don't know how this is going to go.
Yeah. And it's interesting, isn't it? And we're sort of power coaching, and I know Anna and Millie well enough. So for those of you thinking, oh, she's going to pick on me, don't worry. I know Anna and Millie really well. So as I said, I can buy them both a drink afterwards too. But it's interesting, isn't it, when we look back and we start to see, because and it's often what I do when I'm doing one-to-one coaching. What on the face of it might be, or this person's a little bit difficult, a little bit eruptive, actually when we pick and we kind of look underneath the bonnet, we notice, well, actually maybe it is about fairness. Fairness can be a big driver for lots of people, and actually it might be less about the 5 minutes and more about, well, actually what's going on with the other team members. It could be, if you're leading a team, well, actually I want to be, as I said, I'm talking from, I want to be liked. So, what might others be thinking of me? The fact that this person seems to be getting away with being 5 minutes late. So often when you sort of start to go underneath, you can start to, going back to that self-awareness point, understand what is it that's really sitting behind this. And you can start to sort of, challenge yourself around, well, actually, is that therefore reasonable, or is it that trigger of mine that always gets triggered is the thing that's sitting here and bubbling up again?
Yeah.
Anna, can I ask a secondary question that was this person not only turning up 5 minutes late, but were they then taking another 5 minutes to get themselves sorted? Were they then going off and making a cup of tea, getting a glass of water, putting their shoes on, whatever? Were they actually elongating that kind of start time even longer, which was then annoying people even more because, they're like, everyone's like head down and then suddenly someone's faffing around and then, was it exasperated by them also not being ready?
Yeah, that was at play as well. And also then at dead on the dot of what, 10:30, going out for a fag break, and they were the only one in the team that smoked, and then dead on taking their hour for lunch and going out at 3 o'clock for another cigarette break. And yeah, those kind of sort of almost like low level disruptions.
Mm.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because we could all sort of we're probably all starting to think about, oh gosh, now I've got that team member that does this, and I've got that team member that does that. And it's interesting how, there are parallels. Well, some of you might be like, well, I'm the person that turns up 5 minutes late, and actually I end up spending 10 minutes at the end of the day, or, so really useful model, which we're going to come back to. I promised, and for once I'm going to stick to time because we've only got an hour, so I'm going to try and stick to time because I want to try and get to the kind of so what. So my last slide in terms of the kind of the first half around why are these things difficult, and I mentioned that emotion word already. For those who like neuroscience, I have studied neuroscience, which sounds very grand, but anyway, but it's all about amygdala hijack. So it's all about, what I like to describe ourselves as, and it's not technical neuroscience, but we are emotional beings who think. The way that our brain has developed is to, are we safe, is the first question that we ask ourselves, because once we're safe, then we can think, and then we can process, and then we can do everything else. So our amygdala is always on the lookout, thinking about, are we safe, am I not safe? And actually those, again, that SCARF model, which I'll share again, a lot of that comes back to, do I feel safe? Do I feel my autonomy being threatened? That relatedness point, we've been brought up as humans over time to rely on each other because we need that for our survival. So the reason why there is emotion, the reason why these conversations are difficult, is because we get amygdala hijack, which kind of triggers stress response. Flight or fight, is the one that most people know about. There's, tend or befriend, the different responses. But we are emotional beings who think. And I think that part of where I'm leaning into the second half of this session is around, okay, knowing that we are emotional beings who think, knowing that the reason most of these conversations are difficult is because all of a sudden we've got that amygdala hijack. How can we create a change in our brain such that we calm the amygdala, we calm our get our parasympathetic nervous system going, and start to think, basically. And again, really interesting, the two examples that we had from in fact, the three examples that we've had. So Millie, if we go to that really fundamental human question, am I safe? That's triggered in your example. Am I safe? Is the client going to pay me? Am I going to get, my reputation? Loads of different things potentially going on underneath the surface. Anna, in your example, is this person going to kick off? Am I physically going to be safe? Am I going to get shouted at? Am my team going to start shouting? So there are lots of different layers that trigger a response, which makes these conversations difficult. So what can we do? So we're going to use the SCARF model, and then I've got a model that I have devised, which sort of brings in lots of different theories and techniques, and it's also got an acronym, so it's easy to remember. It's a bit of a theme for anyone who's done any training with me. I always use an acronym because it helps my brain, which is otherwise unpredictable. Anyway, so when we start to think about the model and we start to think about how it might show up, we can start to think about, okay, well, how might I react? How might this conversation go differently? And the more we do this and the more we think about this and the more we recognize our own triggers, the more, and the model that is going to come is around preparation. So for those of you who've got a difficult conversation coming up, you can start to think about, okay, what might be going on here and how might I help? But for example, Millie, your example, you will have, because it's the nature of events, you know, it won't be the first time that something like scaffolding happens and you've just got to deal with it. So even being able to reflect on something which in the past has been difficult and thinking about, okay, well, what might have been at play here and how might I deal with it if it pops up again? You know, not a surprise that a number of the people in the chat do like listening, and those difficult conversations are often the two ways, aren't they? One is with the client itself, so you might go and sit down and expect it to be a really positive chat, and all of a sudden the client's like throwing everything at you. Another example might be, okay, well, now I've got to feed that back to this partner internally. That's going to be a challenge. So it's often the case that those conversations we need to have multiple times. So I will share this, and again, let's try and get a bit of a chat going. If it, hopefully it's helpful for those that are kind of observing. I think people learn in different ways. So if you want to kind of join the chat, then please do. Otherwise, we'll sort of pick on the people who are happy to talk. But let's use certainty because it's one I've spoken about a lot. So I think that we like to know what's going to happen, and I think often with these scenarios there is an element of the unexpected which has already come out. So even in Anna's, I don't know how he's going to react. He might blow up, so how can we put ourselves in control such that we can think about this may happen and this is what I can do to try and kind of put myself on the front foot. So for example, the example that I've put on the screen, but actually let's use some of the examples that we've got here, is, we could say, this is what I want to talk about and where the conversation will go. So for example, and I'll use Millie's and Anna's examples. Millie, before you go, there is a lot of uncertainty that's wrapped up in what you were talking about, and there are different ways that you could think about, okay, well, this is going to be at play and this is what I can do to make those conversations easier. So it could be even to the extent of, right, well, before we go to the event, I could say to the partner, look, sometimes unexpected things happen, but don't worry, I'm always there to deal with the unexpected, which automatically reduces the threat of the unexpected because you're there. And I suspect you, knowing and having done a lot with you, I know that that's probably the way you work anyway. In the moment, your client, the client's clients are going to be threatened because of the level of uncertainty that there is. So again, recognizing that right from the beginning and saying, building some, whatever happens, we know that this is going to be okay because, and again, it starts to build in that level of certainty. Anna, with yours, there is a degree of, if you think about it from the other side, and again, goes back to where I started at the beginning around who is the conversation difficult for? And often the conversation is difficult for both of us. And often the reason why it's difficult for us is actually because it's difficult for the other person, which then sort of creates this sort of backwards and forwards. So there's uncertainty for you because you don't know whether he's going to blow up or not. But actually there's uncertainty for him. Am I getting told off? Am I going to be put on probation? There's a multitude of things that could potentially be going on in that person's mind. So again, how can you build certainty in at the beginning? Can you say something like, look, I need to have a discussion with you about, but the discussion really is to get these issues out in the open, and I want to hear your point of view, and it's not about putting you on probation. What can you do to reduce the threat that is present when you're having these difficult conversations? I always think that models are great. When you start to put them into the abstract, they're better because sometimes the abstract is hard to sort of grapple with. So has anyone else got an example that they either want to share and we can pick through together, or maybe something that you kind of has left you curious? And I would invite all of you, we don't have to do this online with everyone, think about if you have one coming up or you've just had one, use this model and use the example that you've got in your mind to sort of unpick and think about, this is possibly what was at play, and this is a way that I could have kind of reduced that threat or increased the empowerment of the other person. Who's feeling brave?
I don't know if this is one, but feedback, when you're giving negative feedback, which the client's given you to like a Vienna, like giving that is sometimes quite difficult, and sometimes more difficult if you have a really good and you feel safe with that person and you have a good relationship, and then you don't want to feel like you're damaging that relationship or putting them off, doing the client listening well. And it kind of puts you in that fear mode of wanting to have that conversation.
Yeah. So we'll do this from two perspectives, because I think it's a really nice example, and one that a couple of people have sort of noted in the chat. So from your perspective, again, looking at this model and thinking about the domains, what domains might be feeling threatened because of that conversation?
Status and relatedness, I guess. The autonomy.
Okay. And then, as I said, this is power coaching for everyone, but hopefully some of these questions will land and you can unpick them at kind of with your own example. From the other perspective, so from the partner's perspective, what might be at play?
Status, that someone might feel humiliated.
Yeah.
Fairness, maybe, like, the client obviously works with lots of people.
Yeah. Yeah. And I suspect, there's probably autonomy at play. So I think, particularly where, kind of feedback back to partners, they, weren't in control of the conversation because they won't have been there. They're not in control of, potentially what's going to happen to the results. You can kind of imagine quite a lot of feeling like I don't have control here, for someone who probably is in a position normally where they are always in control. So that, that puts them in a really difficult position. So that kind of gets us to where we got to at 1 o'clock, which is great. Okay, I know all of this, I can see all of this. This is why this is difficult. So how might you use it to think about, how you might control that conversation? So we'll kind of put to one side the things that show up for you, because part of actually recognizing that can be helpful, and I'll kind of go into that. But when you think about going into that conversation and you recognize, we'll go with autonomy, I'm autonomy and status, because I think those two are probably the highest ones in that situation. Okay, I'm going into this conversation with a partner, and I'm inviting Francesca, but if others on the call have got ideas, also jump in. I'm going into this call with a partner. I've just been given some feedback, which is going to be a little bit challenging for the person to hear. They are likely to feel threatened because their status is kind of getting challenged and they've not got any autonomy here. What might you say to help reduce that threat level? Any ideas, Francesca, but anyone else?
I guess being collaborative and using it as it's a we mentality rather than it's them. Use focusing it like that, and having that adult conversation. I don't know.
Anyone else? I've got some thoughts, but I'll share them at the end. Anyone else got any ideas? No. And it's tricky, which is why, again, this model is like, oh, I can recognize this. Well, what can I do about it? And I think, and it's interesting when you go back to the, I need to be careful because I end up going down rabbit holes. But if we go to the right amygdala hijack, high level fight or flight, it can be the response that we have. Okay, feels like this is going to be uncomfortable. I'm just not going to say anything. I'll just stick my head in the sand. That's the flight mode, isn't it, coming in? But sadly, that isn't always an option, and arguably isn't the thinking option. So how can we give control back to that person? How can we make sure that they can see that their status isn't threatened? A lot of it comes into how can we frame before we start the feedback. So things like we've received this feedback, and and actually framing it doesn't necessarily need to be in the conversation. So sometimes you might say, well, actually, this is going to be really challenging to hear. Let's let them know in advance of the conversation that they're going to be triggered, so that triggering happens before we have the conversation. Would be one way to deal with it, which is not sticking your head in the sand. It's kind of, thinking about, there is going to be an emotional response here, so how can I make sure I let that emotion go through before we then have the thinking? And if you do it in the moment, actually a thing to note is, don't expect to then have a sensible discussion about it, because you probably won't, because they'll be in emotion mode, they won't be in thinking mode. So there is something about how we frame it, which could be, when we do these exercises, and I think it's leaning into the we, Francesca, but also recognizing that some of it will be you, it won't be we, but starting with the we, when we do these exercises, we always expect to hear things that are positive and things that we need to work on. So it doesn't become about you, it becomes about, this exercise always generates things which can be perceived to be good and things that can be perceived to be things we need to work on. Giving a framework for what is going to happen. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share back what we heard. It might be that you want to have some time to think about it, and then we can come back and work out how we deal with it and what we do about it later. Again, providing that distance between emotion and thinking. Around the control and the autonomy, you will notice coaches, and I do it a lot, inviting people to do things or giving people the option of where they want to go. So again, how can you give autonomy to someone in a situation where they might feel that they don't have autonomy? It might start before the conversation happens. We've had some feedback, it's a little bit challenging. Would you prefer I send it to you before we have the conversation? Some people might say yes, some people might say no, but what it's done is it's given them that autonomy back. So you can start to think about, okay, recognizing that this is going to trigger something, and it might not. Some partners are like, bring it on, I'm happy with all of the, but for many, it's going to trigger a response. And it's about, how can I recognize that that's going to happen, and how can I frame it such that it doesn't escalate and come to a place which isn't helpful. Any questions on that? Make sense? I'm going to share another model. We've got 15 minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share another model. And again, we'll sort of just finish with kind of a chat. But what I'd invite you to do on this one is, as I said, I will share the slides, and I'd invite you to look through again with an example, either of a conversation that's happened that you think, oh, that was just a real disaster, or one that you've got coming up that you want to sort of unpick and think about, how might I deal with that going forward? And for those of us, we all have that type of conversation that we always find challenging. So how might we do it? And actually, I'm going to follow my own advice, and I might follow this through with talking about fees, which, as I said, for me is the thing that I find the most difficult. So I might practice what I preach and do it myself. But unpick and think about, not only from your perspective, but from the other person's perspective. But this is a model that I've kind of devised myself, and I actually devised it in the context of some training I was doing around DEI. And it's interesting because recently I did some training on DEI, and I had a really difficult conversation at the end of the session. And I kind of used this model without thinking, but it sort of has underlined to me why it is so powerful. So I did a session on female leadership. I do a lot of sessions on female leadership because I've done some research on it, and I'm lucky enough to get invited to speak about it because it's a real passion project of mine. And someone came up at the end of the session, and they challenged me, first of all, as to why we were doing the session in the first place, what was the point, and really had some quite kind of challenging views around some of the things that I'd said. Now, I could have gone into feeling threatened, and I did. Like, I definitely felt like, oh, this is feeling like this isn't going to be a comfortable conversation. But I recognised that, and I managed to kind of slip into thinking mode and listening mode. And actually, the conversation was a really nice, powerful conversation, because if particularly in the context of DEI, if we want to have diversity, we want to make the most of diversity, we need to be able to have conversations where we may or may not agree, where there is a degree of conflict. So let me share the model, and then, as I said, we can then have a little bit of a chat. And this is also going to be a bit of a power through, because I want to provide you with lots of things to think about and reflect on. So The acronym is PLEASE. So it's a nice, easy one to remember. And we've already done an element of this already. And I've put please empathise because for me, empathy is super important because it goes back to who is in front of us. And it's easy to think about this is really difficult for me because I'm going to get shouted at or my team don't think that I'm doing a good job. But actually, it's, we rarely put ourselves into the shoes of the person in front of us. And we rarely think about, well, why might it be difficult for them? What is it about this conversation that means that they don't feel empowered, which in turn is going to make this even more difficult for me? So please empathise. So prepare. We've already kind of been talking about that really, which is why is it uncomfortable? Understanding that is helpful because it takes us out of that amygdala hijack. And what is my objective? And again, I'm going to end with two questions, and it kind of ties back into this. What is it that I'm looking to achieve from these conversations? Because holding that in mind can also help you in terms of the preparation. So for Millie, what my objective is here is to make sure that the client feels like I'm on it and to get the thing done and to get the thing delivered. Francesca, for your example, it's about, well, I need to make sure that we act on whatever it is that we've heard. And it could be that some of what we've heard we can absolutely act on. It could be that some of it is a personality clash or something like that, which actually, may or may not be helpful, may or may not be the key objective of what I'm feeding back here. Anna, in your example, your key objective might have been, it might have been to get the person in on time. It might have been actually to recognize I can't get in because my train doesn't allow me to. I can stay 5 minutes later and we can articulate that to the team. So what is your objective is really helpful to know at the beginning. It will come as no surprise that listening is in there because a lot of what I do, a lot of coaching comes back to active listening, and it sort of comes in three, in fact, L, E, A, and S all tie up into active listening because listening is key, but actually empathizing, asking, and summarizing are all ways that we can demonstrate that we're actively listening. So I'm going to canter through the next couple of slides because they are effectively a kind of a full day workshop that I've condensed into 5 minutes. But again, some of you will have already heard and been on training with me, or some of you, hopefully will just get your mind thinking slightly differently. So a reminder on active listening for those who have done active listening with me before, you will have seen this because I always share this because for me it's the best reminder of what active listening is. It's Steve Covey, who is the seek first to be understood. No, seek first to understand and then be understood, the other way around. The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And what he set out was 5 different levels of listening. So we start at the me with children when they're asking for some money. In fact, a particular one of my 4 children asking for some money, and I'm really not there and I'm not listening at all. Where most of us are most of the time, which is in selective listening. So we're waiting for that nugget that kind of either aligns with what we expect, or in the case of those 3, that kind of that's the thing that I'm looking for. The rest of it is just kind of now taking up airtime. But where we want to be when we're actively listening is level 4 or 5, and it's where we lean into actually this isn't about me, it's about recognizing what is going on for the person, what are they saying. And empathic listening is really deep listening where we start to be able to pick up on the emotion of the other person. We start to be able to pick up on the subtleties that aren't necessarily being said. And actually, for difficult conversations, super important. So if you start to feel nervous, are these my nerves or is this person opposite me feeling nervous? And it's what coaches spend a lot of time learning as coaches is what's mine and what's not mine. And actually it's quite powerful when it happens to you. It sounds very weird, but it's happened to me a couple of times where I've been holding something which isn't mine. It's absorbed from the person who's sitting in front of me. So one of the things you can start to do is start to feel curious. So Francesca, using your example, gosh, I'm feeling really nervous here. Could be that it's your nerves. It could be actually that the partner's just feeling super nervous because it's like, oh God, what's this going to mean? I'm feeling under threat here. So active listening, really important. And there's another model that I often share, which is an acronym. I haven't put it on these slides, but I'll share it now. And it's use your OARS, which Anna will have heard because I use it a lot. And again, it's another acronym. So OARS, open-ended questions. A is affirmation, so play back positives that you hear in the conversation. R is reflection, so playing stuff back. So if you hear a word that you find interesting, you can play it back to someone. And S is summarizing. So if you look at my model, which I'll share again in a moment, but by asking the right questions, by summarizing. So what I'm hearing is, you know, Millie, in your example, again, it just diffuses the emotion. So what I'm hearing is, you know, your clients are turning up in 5 minutes. You know, what can I summarize back? What you really need is this. It helps people feel heard and listened to. And it leads into empathy because when we listen, we demonstrate empathy. And when we listen in the context of a difficult conversation, and when we empathize with the person in front of us in a different conversation, actually it automatically shifts our emotional state, because it's not about how am I feeling and I'm getting wrapped up in my emotion, but because we are there then looking to help the person opposite us, it actually calms our emotion, which makes the conversation easier for us. So it's a really good technique to think about and switch to what's going on for the other person, because in trying to help that other person, we help ourselves, as is often the way. Again, I can go down a rabbit hole with empathy, so I'm just going to sort of share some thinking around empathy, because I think empathy is a word that gets thrown around a lot and sometimes misunderstood. So there are different levels of empathy. Cognitive empathy is about understanding the other person's point of view. So in the example that I gave about the conversation that I had, that was difficult. You know, the person had views that were different from mine, but they came very much from the culture with which he had been brought up. And I could understand that. It wasn't, you know, whether I agreed or disagreed didn't matter. I could understand that that had come from somewhere, and that was, you know, we all are shaped by our environment and our culture. Emotional empathy is where we feel alongside someone else. It goes to the point I was saying about really truly listening to someone. We can start to feel the emotion that someone else has. Compassionate empathy is often what people talk about when they talk about empathy leading to action. So compassionate empathy is about not just understanding and not just feeling, but also being driven to do something and understanding what it is that thing is that needs to happen. And it moves us from kind of simply observing and this is interesting to this is something I can do. Versus sympathy, which is the thing that empathy often gets confused with, which is feeling sorry for someone. That's not what empathy is, and that's not what we're talking about here. So within that model of please empathize, it's about thinking, what do I need from this conversation? Why might this conversation be difficult for me? Why might this conversation be difficult for the other person? How can I switch into listening mode? Because when I listen, I empathize. And when I empathize, I help the person in front of me tick off some of those boxes actually in that SCARF model. I give them some autonomy. I give them some certainty. I give them that relatedness. It also leans into what is interesting. When I talk about difficult conversations, often you will hear, oh, it's because the person is challenging. It is because the person is difficult. And actually often it is because we find the person difficult, or it is because we find the person challenging. And Anna, your example, quite a good one there as well. I find it challenging that this person could go somewhere, a direction that I don't know. I find this person difficult because actually I don't like conflict. So as soon as I get into a conflict, I'm feeling uncomfortable. So, you know, again, it's who is this uncomfortable for and why? And it could just be that this person is different from us, and it tends to be the people who are different from us that we find challenging. So if I color wheel, one of the things I, again, going down a different rabbit hole, I do is kind of what preferences do we have, do we lead into? And I lead with yellow, and for anyone who knows me, and you've probably gathered from this call, I process aloud, I think aloud, I talk aloud. I work a lot with Anna, and Anna, I don't know if you've done one of these before, not asked, but I suspect you're more of an internal thinker. So actually that's challenging for me, because I'm someone who needs to be like, and Anna needs to process it internally. So again, it's not that Anna's difficult or that I'm difficult, it's just that we think differently and we work in different ways. So that's where those difficult conversations can sometimes come in. So I'll show this slide, I'll show this model. I'm going to end with kind of 2 questions that I always think helpful to ask. We will then be on the hour, so if you need to jump, you can jump. If you want to stay and kind of tie up and ask questions, I've got time, so I'll stay on the call. But these 2 questions, I think, if everyone asked themselves these 2 questions before they did something, the world would be a much better place. And it's, is it helpful? And we'll go through the 3 examples that we had. Is it helpful for the person to know that they're turning up 5 minutes late and that's causing the team discomfort? Yes, that is probably helpful, because they probably don't even realise that that 5 minutes is an issue. They probably just think, well, it's 5 minutes and I'll give 5 minutes later on. Is it helpful to give the partner the advice that you've heard from a client? Yes, because if they know they can do something about it. It could be that there is an element of something that's been given that isn't helpful to share, because actually there's nothing, so again, there are degrees to this, but on a high level, yes, it's helpful. There might be nuances where actually, no, it's not helpful. I don't need to share this information. Millie, in your example, is it helpful? Well, yes, because we need to get this damn thing done. We need to get it delivered. And is it kind? And I think, again, part of the reason I did the model is there are ways that we can deliver messages, which is done in a way that is kind. Kind is a bit like nice, isn't it? The English teachers tell you not to use. It's a bit, blah, but is it kind? Am I delivering this in a way which is as kind as possible? Am I giving people the autonomy, the certainty, the predictability that they need? Am I doing this in an open forum? Am I doing it in behind the scenes? So lots of different ways that we can kind of use these 2 questions. Thank you to those that are messaging. I am aware that some people probably need to jump off, but as I said, I don't need to jump off. So if anyone wants to kind of concluding thoughts and kind of tie up, then feel free to do so. But thank you for entertaining me and listening to me, and hopefully it's been helpful for you to think about your kind of difficult conversations, whatever they might be, in a slightly different way.